let's move to Tibet, and honestly, it's even more of a done deal than the Taiwan issue is. I mean, if it was a baked potato, stick a fork in it, because it is done. And I hate to say that because we all love the Buddhist, right? And the Dalai Lama with the flowing robes and everything. And you may even have a free Tibet bumper sticker on your Humvee, but I'm here to tell you it's probably not ever going to be a free Tibet. Because even as of right this second, there's not any sovereign state on planet Earth that recognizes Tibet as a sovereign state. Any map you look at of the states of the world or a map of China itself will include Tibet as a fully integrated, politically, economically, culturally, every other way, legally, as a part of China proper. It's a autonomous region within China. I pointed that out in a prior lecture as well. So there are lots of states of China, full-fledged states, like this U.S. has 50 states. There are lots of states of China, but places like Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia are autonomous regions based mostly off of that in the past, the majority of folks in that autonomous region were of a different ethnicity. So it was the mostly Tibetan people, so they made the Tibetan Autonomous Region. But even that has started to become kind of an outright joke for reasons that I'll talk about as I tell the story very quickly. Now, as we pointed out, classic China, for thousands of years, the core was always in the east. However, in times of strong dynasties and strong leadership, power would expand and their geographic parameters would expand and their borders would expand. And when that dynasty would crash, they might retract back in another dynasty, and then the dynasty gets strong and they expand again. So empire expanding or retracting based on the power of that dynasty is nothing new. For most of the last few thousand years, though, Tibet was its own separate kingdom, okay? It was not for most of the last 3,000 years, and this I have to say these things delicately because this can be offensive to Chinese folks. And I'll just tell you as a side note, you know me, I'm not going to pull any punches. In Chinese classes, in Chinese kindergarten class all the way up through college and university, Chinese folks are taught Tibet is part of China. Same way, Taiwan is part of China, and they always have been, always, 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 since the dawn of the planet. And that's a bit of an exaggeration. Tibet, for most of its history, has been an independent kingdom with its own monarchy and power structure, and again, it's a different ethnicity, with different peoples, with their different cultures, and in the last 2,000 years, it's mostly been a Buddhist-inspired culture, and that's why kind of it's the Dalai Lama is actually a holy figure, not necessarily a political one, although that's been bled together at times in the past as well. So it's a very distinct, ethnically, culturally, religiously, Tibet is quite distinct, has been quite distinct from the rest of China. Really, if you go back 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years, it's not part of whatever dynasty is in charge of China at that time. So Tibet is sometimes a fully independent kingdom, sometimes heavily influenced by China. So again, when a strong dynasty crops up and they're pushing out borders, that kingdom of Tibet may come under heavy influence, meaning that the Chinese leadership at the time could come and say, hey, here's the deal. Do what we want you to do or we're going to invade. And the kingdom could say, okay, we can be a vassal state, much the way the Koreas were, I would say the Korean Peninsula was, much the same way Japan was. For most of Chinese history, these are vassal states that understand that China is the power. And if China wants to take them over, they could. And so they just suck up a little bit and say, no. We'll pay taxes to you guys or a tribute or whatever you need, and we promise not to attack you guys if you promise not to attack us. So it's not as if Tibet and China, whatever dynasty it was in charge, didn't know each other, didn't interact. Sometimes Tibet was much more independent in times of Chinese weakness. Sometimes Tibet was much more ingrained or influenced by China in times of Chinese dynastic strength. And sometimes it was outright controlled by China. And now that gets us mostly to the last 500 to 600 years, because you can find maps that are 1,000 years old, 800 years old, 500 years old, 300 years old, and sometimes they'll list Tibet independently, sometimes they'll be incorporated as a part of China. However, when we start to get to the last 400 years, increasingly Tibet is fully absorbed into what we'd call China. And we're going back to some names you're familiar with now, the Manchu or Qing dynasty. the last dynasty of China, the one that gets thrown out in 1912. The Manchu/Qings were in charge from 1644 to about 1911. Very powerful dynasty, already pointed out, long period of stability. From 1661 to 1795, it had just 3 emperors. You don't have to write any of this down. I just want to set the stage for Tibet. And under this consistent, stable, long period of leadership, the Qing reached their largest territorial extent. And that's the map I've showed you before, and I'll show it to you again. It's at this point that Tibet, a kingdom which is on again, off again, been fully independent of China, on again, off again, been heavily influenced by China. Now with the Manchu in charge, it gets fully absorbed by China, territorially absorbed. Got it? So you can go back to say 1400 or 1500. Some Chinese scholars do that, but by 1600, 1700, yes, Tibet was fully part of the Qing dynasty. Okay, however, suckiness ensues in the Qing dynasty by 1800. This is the story I told you in some detail already. The Manchus become corrupt, inefficient, weak. The Europeans are attacking. The Japanese start attacking as the Japanese rise up. And by 1912, the Qing dynasty completely falls. They depose the last emperor of China. And it's at this point, again, cyclical in history. No big deal if you know history. It's at this point of Chinese weakness when a major dynasty collapses that Tibet declares independence again and says, yay, the strong dynasty has gone. We are going to re-exert our independent status. And from 1912 right on through World War II, the Tibetan leadership was trolling around the world trying to get folks to recognize them. If you've ever gone and seen any films about the life of the Dalai Lama, including this one with Brad Pitt, I think, in it. There's lots of movies, and these are regular film features, not like documentaries. But they'll often portray the Tibetan leadership kind of saying, hey, well, the United States will recognize us, right? Or we'll get France to recognize us, or let's get the United Kingdom to recognize us. And even maybe start a relationship with them. We want to start a relationship while China's weak. While China's weak, let's get things going. It never really panned out. Most of the rest of the major powers in the world were busy with World War I and then subsequently World War II. People were looking at, I say people, the major powers were looking at the chaos that was China at the time from, say, 1912 right on up to World War II. And we're saying, we don't know who's in charge here. We don't know who to recognize. And so we're just going to be hands off. And that includes we're not really going to recognize Tibet either. So even though they tried, Tibet never really secured a stable, strong world ally. They really had their money on the United States, but it just never happened. Okay? And now we can tell the story again that you already know. 1949, the communists win. Under Mao, China stands back up. Period of humiliation is over, and we're going to unify the country again, get rid of the local warlords, and that includes this crazy-ass place over here on our southwestern flank called Tibet that's declared independence. No, they're not. We're going to reincorporate them back into the motherland that is China. And you know what? We'll even be nice to you. Now I'm pretending to be the Chinese government. We'll be nice to you, Tibet. We understand there's a lot of Tibetan people there that ain't Chinese. We'll make you an autonomous region. That means you'll have some self-rule over your affairs. And there were those in Tibet that said, okay, well, the Chinese have a really big army right now and they're unifying their country, so we're not in a position to argue. We don't have a strong military to combat that. However, there were local protests and there were local people and local warlords and local tribesmen in Tibet who said, hell no, we're not willingly going to be reabsorbed back into China. We'll fight. And fight, some of them did. And in 1950, Chinese soldiers marched back into Tibet and basically, I won't say at gunpoint, but pretty much at gunpoint, made the leadership sign the 17-point agreement, which reaffirmed or affirmed that the People's Republic of China have sovereignty over this area called Tibet, but are granting them limited autonomy. So 1950, Chinese troops moved back into Tibet. After a period of absence, again, for decades and decades, maybe a century, I don't know, China was in chaos during the end of the Manchu. So 1950, Chinese soldiers march back in. 1951, they forcibly make them sign this agreement. And again, this didn't sit well with a lot of local folks. Some in the Tibetan Buddhist leadership, some in the monarchical line, against some local tribes people who just said, no, we're not going to do this. So there were uprisings, and particularly one in 1959. There was a pretty major uprising called the Tibetan Rebellion by Tibetan historians, and that's when China fully invades. So in 1951 or 1950, they'd sent troops back in, but I mean, not troops to secure the area, not troops to conquer anybody. Basically to bring law and order, and basically a show of force that would tell the Tibetans, don't do any protests because we're here. That didn't work. So by 1959, then they send in real military force, like hundreds and thousands of soldiers and tanks and guns, and you got the whole 9 yards with me now, right? So China invades fully, and that's when the spiritual leader, and sometimes thought of as the political leader of Tibet, the Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, flees the country. The Chinese basically have courted him and said, hey, you should come to Beijing and hang out with us. Hey, you should do what we want you to do. Hey, buddy, if you don't do what we want you to do, it's going to be trouble for you and your peeps. And they knew if the Dalai Lama, in the end game of this, in the late 1950s, if he would have went to Beijing, they would have imprisoned him, possibly even killed him. We don't know. And so he fled to India, physically walked across the border with a small contingent of folks, and has spent the rest of his life from 1959 to now, and this is 2016, he's still alive, basically petitioning. Again, he's a monk, he's a Buddhist monk, speaking on behalf of the religion, but also on behalf of Tibetan people to preserve their culture. He has said for decades, look, I'm not trying to incite Tibet to become an independent sovereign state. I'm not doing that. The Chinese government have always said, yes, you are. You're trying to foment a revolution. You're trying to foment Tibetan rebellion. You're trying to go around the world to kiss everyone's ass to get them to recognize Taiwanese sovereignty. And we don't like you and we hate you. And actually the Chinese government thinks the Dalai Lama is basically a terrorist, even though most of the rest of the world thinks he's like a super cool, super hip religious dude who just wants peace and harmony, man, and spiritual liberation, and maybe, to recognize the Tibetan culture and help preserve the Tibetan culture. That's what he himself would say his job is. And he's been bestowed with every prize and award, Nobel Peace Prizes, and American highest honors you can get in America and France and other countries. And this always infuriates the Chinese. So he is on the blacklist of most hated people in China. The rest of the world thinks he's a super hip, awesome guy that they give awards to, which again infuriates the Chinese. The Chinese, as modern China has rose up in power, they have used their economic and political clout to pressure countries to not let the Dalai Lama even come visit. This happened just a year or two ago. I think it was just last year, where the Dalai Lama was supposed to go give a talk in South Africa, and China basically went to South Africa and said, if you do this, if you let him in the country, we're going to pull some big economic deal out from under you. And South Africa said, oh, okay, hang on. Sorry, Dalai Lama, your entry visa just got canceled. So the same way that the Chinese government looks at Taiwan and doesn't want anybody recognizing Taiwan, the Chinese government doesn't want anybody cozying up to the Dalai Lama, doesn't want anyone even hosting the Dalai Lama for talks, under fear that he will somehow generate enough sympathy on the planet for everybody to want to have a free and independent Tibet. Does that make sense? I can't stress this enough. Again, this is going to offend my Chinese friends. And I know lots of Chinese students who have explained to me over the years, you don't understand. No one in the West understands. The Dalai Lama is a pirate and a terrorist, and he wants to kill all Chinese people. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. Hang on, why do you think that? And they have a litany. So they teach in school, in Chinese schools, they teach Tibetan history very specifically, and they teach about Tibetan history. It's a monarchy. It's a dictatorship monarchy, and the Dalai Lama was a dictator, and that it was an impoverished place intentionally, and that the Dalai Lama, not just this Dalai Lama, but all the Dalai Lamas before him, are a religious monarchy of sorts and have used their power to crush the peasants, and that the Chinese government has basically gone in there and helped improve the place and has brought law and order to this place. And before the Chinese showed up, these people were all impoverished, in desperate poverty, and high prevalence of disease and childhood disease and starvation. And you know what? Some of that's true. So the Chinese attitude is, we have brought civilization to this place, and this guy, the Dalai Lama, is a terrorist who's trying to tear away this piece of our territory from us. So he is vilified big time in China. If he were to go visit China, he'd probably be ripped apart by the general public, ripped from limb. So it's very interesting. I don't know that there's a more polarizing human alive right now than the Dalai Lama, because there's a billion Chinese people who think he's absolutely the devil, and a billion other people in the West who think that he's an angel. It's a really bizarre scenario, but that's what's going on with it. Now, what is he up to right now? I mean, the guy's got to be pushing 90. He still does talks all over planet Earth, usually at universities and religious meetings and lots of things. He still preaches that, look, I'm not trying to generate support for an independent Tibet. I'm trying to generate support for China to give back real autonomy to Tibet, to help protect Tibetan culture because it's disappearing. And that's one of the things that I also need to point out that may offend my Chinese friends is the Chinese have been very busy since 1959 making sure that Tibet can never be independent. And here's how. They have encouraged Han Chinese migration to Tibet, encouraged with tax breaks, with absolute monetary giveaways, with land giveaways, with businesses propositions of let's get hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Han Chinese people to move to Tibet. And that's exactly what's been going on since 1960. So much so that now in today's world, here in the early 21st century, Tibet is no longer majority Tibetan. It now is a majority Han. And it may be 50, 60, or 65% now Han Chinese, whereas in 1950 it was 90 or 95% Tibetan. So the Chinese government's approach has been to change the ethnic equation, basically. And now the Chinese government can state with some degree of 100% truthfulness, what do you mean free Tibet? We can't free Tibet. It's Chinese people. Not only do we think it's Chinese territory, but it's Chinese people there. We can't free it. It's our people. And that's pretty much true. And there, again, was never a whole lot of question about this ever since 1949, because no other sovereign state even recognizes Tibet as a sovereign state. No one really greets the Dalai Lama as the leader of a free Tibet. No one does that. The Chinese, though, are still insistent that they do not like this guy and they want him to go away. The Chinese government has actually taken an additional step for decades, that they have said that they've already picked the next Dalai Lama. See, the Dalai Lama is a religious incarnation of powerful spiritual leaders within Buddhism. And so this current Dalai Lama is the reincarnation of a past important Buddhist figure. And you have to find him. There's lots of great movies about this. Go find one called Little Buddha. You'll love that movie if you want to understand Buddhism. And they have said, here in Beijing, we already have the 15th Dalai Lama. We found him. We already know who he is. He's a Han Chinese guy, and he's sitting right here in our palace with us. So watch the news for this. When His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama dies, and again, he's an older gentleman, so it's going to be soon. He's starting to retire from public life. He's gotten that old. When he passes away, the Chinese government will have waiting in the wings their preordained next Dalai Lama, and they're going to insist that he's the one, and this is all a done deal. Does that make sense? I don't know that it does unless you're really into Buddhism and reincarnation, but it certainly is the case that you can put your Free Tibet bumper sticker on your car, but there's not a whole lot of hope of that ever becoming a reality. There wasn't much hope of that becoming a reality 50 years ago, but now that China is super strong and nobody wants to piss them off for fear of severing economic ties with China, the world's fastest growing economy, no one's going to do that. No one was going to do it even 20 years ago, and certainly no one's doing it now. And with Chinese growing military strength, there's not even a whole lot of aspirations that something physical would happen from within Tibet in terms of a riot or a protest or uprising. It still happens, by the way. Mostly it's monks that go catch themselves on fire in protest of Chinese rule, but that's probably about as far as it goes. Every few years you'll see another big crop up of internal protest and people catching themselves on fire and stuff, but it gets sequestered and put down fairly quickly by the Chinese military, and it seems like that's going to be the way that it goes for the rest of our lives. Got it? So both Taiwan and Tibet, sovereign issues that have been big thorns in the Chinese government's side, both of them with an increasingly powerful China, are really not that important. They're important to the Taiwanese and Tibetan folks, don't get me wrong, but they're kind of a done deal in the mind of the Chinese government, and most of the world is agreeing with the Chinese government on this. Got it? Okay. Sorry to my Tibetan friends or my Taiwanese friends who still yearn for a freer, whatever freer thing you want, but it does seem to be that the way we're going here in the 21st century. And that's because China is so supremely powerful here in early 21st century, and that brings me to thing 5. Let's get to that next.